Welcome to the Psychology Talk Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Scott Hoye. The Psychology Talk Podcast is a unique conversation with experts in the field of mental health from around the globe. Topics include hypnosis and mind-body treatments, ethics and cultural diversity, psychotherapy and psychiatry, emerging treatment modalities, and much, much more. While you're listening, please give us a like and subscribe to the show. It helps us to continue to provide excellent programming. And now, here is the episode. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today, my guest is Dan Lyons. Dan is the author of a new book, STFU, that's Shut the F Up, The Power of Keeping Your Mouth Shut in an Endlessly Noisy World, from Henry Holt. This book recently made the cover of Time magazine. Dan is the best-selling author of Disrupted. He's a seasoned journalist, formerly with Forbes and Newsweek, a writer for HBO's acclaimed comedy series, Silicon Valley, and now a repentant yacker who almost lost his marriage, almost drove his children away, and absolutely got fired from an internet startup because he could not STFU. In STFU, Lyons combines leading behavioral science with actionable advice on how to communicate with intent, think critically, and open your mind and ears to the world around you, and at the same time, shut the fuck up. Today, he is here to discuss that advice and likely much more. Dan, welcome to the Psychology Talk Podcast.
Well, thank you so much for having me here.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, maybe you can kind of just bring up why you wrote the book, which is kind of what's in the book.
Yeah. So the book began as kind of a personal journey. And then because my background is in journalism, I ended up doing a lot of research and reporting and learning a lot about this sort of larger subject of speech, well-being, communication, and applying it to your work life, your home life, your parenting, your love. But it began because this was right in the beginning of the pandemic lockdown. I was pretty much kind of hitting bottom in a lot of ways. So my wife and I had separated in the October before the lockdown, and you couldn't boil it down to saying, well, it's just that I talk too much. But and I started realizing there were other things that had gone wrong in my life where, geez, if I just hadn't said that, boy, none of this other cascade of things could have happened that led to this bad outcome. And in addition to that, I had for several years at least started really being concerned about my compulsive talking, my inability to shut up, even when I knew it was in my best interest, even when I knew the thing I'm about to say, I'm going to regret. But in some cases, it's so funny, I have to say it, or I want to see the shocked look on someone's face. And it wasn't even not like horrible, bad things, but sort of off color, or a little bit of a zing where you're like, well, it was kind of true, but you didn't need to zing that person, my sister. I didn't need to zing my sister.
Yeah.
And then cause 6 months of, strife and tension and not talking to each other, when I was like, you just could have held that back. So I thought, well, why didn't I? And so I sort of had two questions. And we were talking about this a minute ago. There was change, then came into insight. In this case, it wasn't quite change, but I had decided to change. Then I looked at, okay, so why are some people compulsive talkers? And then two, how do you fix it? Because, there's a zillion books about how to be a public speaker, and there aren't any that teach you how to not talk. So yeah, I set off on this really journey to fix myself, and ended up discovering all this research that indicates, in fact, anyone or almost anyone can change their life by three things: talking less, listening more, and then communicating with intention. Knowing why you're going to say something before you say it.
Yeah. Okay. And so, so through your research, you know, having read the book myself, I see that you really were wanting to dig into, you know, the nuts and bolts of why this happens, right? I mean, you mentioned in the book a couple different interesting things, and researchers who came up with a Talkaholic kind of scale, and also one of their students or mentees who went on to do some brain research on why some people have a hard time STFU.
Right. Yeah. Now, I need to preface all this. It's a little intimidating because you're a real psychologist, and I interviewed real psychologists, but you know, I'm always worried. Like, I was terrified. Those people are not psychologists, but I interviewed other people who are psychologists. But with any scientist or expert, you're always terrified. You do the best you can writing it and you check with them. But I'm always terrified it's going to come out and they're going to say, what? Like, that's not what I think. But so far I haven't had any complaints like that. But
no. In fact, I would say that it was really well. You described the research findings, how it applied to you, how it might apply to other people, and the book's a really nice, succinct way of providing advice for ways to turn your mind and your mouth off and listen more. So I think it's a very good book. It's
cool.
It's an actionable and well written book.
Well, thank you. But so on the Talkaholics, I actually just did a Google search because I kind of thought of this word. I wonder if I'm a talkaholic. Anybody thought of that? It's like, you know, it's like being an alcoholic. I have a lot of people in my life who, friends and family who are alcoholics. I'm sort of familiar with that. Unfortunately, often it's a tough thing. And I did just Google search, and it turns out, oh my gosh, there were these people in the 90s, this husband and wife team at West Virginia University who were communication professors. So not psychologists, but communication people. And they had sort of defined this condition that they called talkaholism, and defined a kind of person as a talkaholic. And this was a long time ago, and I went through a series of universities where they had taught, like, chasing down this trail to find them. And the husband had passed away, I'd say 10 years ago or so. But Virginia Richmond was retired and living in West Virginia. And I had to find an email address for her. Anyway, I found her, and she got back to me. And by then I had read the work they had done. And we had this amazing conversation. She's this fascinating woman. She is actually very, very shy. Her late husband was a talkaholic. And I said to her, how did you get along? And she said, oh, it was great. And he used to rely on me to give him a little signal, because he knew too, like, I'm getting going too much. And she would have a signal with him. She'd put her hand on his hand and he'd go, oh, okay. And they originally had studied shyness, like communication, apprehension, and then decided to look at the other side. So they had defined this. They created a scale, a quiz you can take. The possible scores would be between 10 and 50, and I got a 50. And well, that's not good. But they had never figured out why, what were the causes. But she referred me to another professor who had been a colleague of her husband's and had done research together with him. And he's still teaching. He's at University of Miami. His name is Michael Beatty, and also a very eccentric guy, an extreme talkaholic. Probably one of the most, or one of the most talkative people I've ever met. And we would get on the phone.
So he was like a 65, 75 on this scale.
Oh yeah. He'd be way off. Yeah. we'd get on the phone and he'd talk for 3 hours. And I would just be doing things like one time I was talking to him, I'm interviewing and taking notes. And then I realized, oh gosh, I got to go get my son at the bus stop. So I just kind of like took my phone and put my stuff down and went out, got in the car, started the car, drove to the bus stop. My son got in. I was like, he was still talking. This guy was still going. And we got back to the house. He kept talking. But he's like amazing. So I met these like crazy characters. That was the other thing that was really fun. See, as a reporter, I really like being a reporter. You could just get to meet people, ask them questions about what they do, and then write their stories. It's like amazing. You meet such cool people. So anyway, this is a long story. Now I'm revealing my Talkaholic side, but he had done all this work with scientists and came to believe, or I guess to discover that your propensity to talk is related to imbalance, neuronal imbalance in your brain, and that if your right side fires more than your left side, that makes you impulsive and also compulsive, and makes you an overtalker, and vice versa. And that the degree to which you are an overtalker or an undertalker correlates with how far out that imbalance is. So, well, that's great. So then, okay, so how do I fix it? And he said, oh, no, you can't fix it. You can't rewire your brain. Like that's it. But I'm sitting there thinking, well, like, yeah, but I want to get, my most pressing thing was to repair my marriage. And I really did believe that if I could learn to communicate better in every way, which partly talking less, mostly listening more, then I could fix my marriage. And I was working with a therapist, I still am, who was very, very good. And she was working with me. The one line she always repeated was, you can always say nothing. You can always say nothing. And I go, oh, no. But then I really kind of thought of it, and I realized, like, oh yeah, like really, literally, even if people are pulling your toenails out with it, you can say nothing. You can always, that's the option is always there. And, and that struck me. I mean, it's kind of obvious, right? But, someone sends you a mean text. In this case, my wife sends me a, and, I kind of want to zing back and get the one up, like, well, blah, 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 and then you get into that sort of tennis match that's really, destructive.
Yeah.
And I would train myself to just see that text and go, oh, God, I'm so mad. I want to and then just put the phone down, go for a walk, and realize, like, well, at the most petty way, I'd say, well, if I don't write back, that's going to piss her off even more than if I write back. So it's very passive aggressive, but at least it was better than escalating. And then I think, well, if I don't write back, that lets it settle, right? That she probably feels bad. She just wrote that thing. And if she sits with it for a while and I don't respond, she's going to start to go like, I wish I hadn't said that, right?
Yeah.
And this is basics for you. I'm sure this is basic stuff. But yeah. And then I found other research that says overtalking is produced by anxiety, which to me makes a lot of sense. And even ADHD or bipolar 2, sort of hypomania. And then I found a lot of people who are doing some interesting research around hypomania at Yale. So yeah, it just kind of led me down this rabbit hole of meeting very interesting people.
Yeah. Well, the book reads like kind of an adventure, like a self-discovery adventure, and certainly I think could be helpful for people who are counselors or a psychologist or whatnot, social workers who do therapy with people as a kind of bibliotherapy. I think it would be very helpful, and advice for some people to kind of, because it kind of normalizes it. Like you do go into the neurology of it. You do kind of you do show that like there is about 5% of the population has this issue of over talking, and they might not even have bipolar 2, or they might not even have ADHD. It just might, they might feel more like a need to be present and assert themselves, and need to kind of build a dial in to turn that back a little bit, like a rheostat to kind of turn it down a bit. And I think the book kind of gives several good suggestions. How did you, you talk about the role of social media and making us becoming more blabbermouthed, or, we all have to tell each other our opinion. I remember, you probably remember this too, growing up. I'm Gen X, so I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and I don't remember. I think you just never talked about politics or religion at the dinner table, and I think that's right. The lid's been blown off the crock pot, so to speak.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah. Or I think there was also the thing where you're in the neighborhood, say, I'm trying to imagine when you mentioned that, like I remember growing up in this neighborhood and a lot of families, a lot of kids, there was so many kids the same age. It was great. But, the dads would all get together. And I suppose you all knew so-and-so is a real hardcore Republican. Actually, where I grew up, probably most people around us were Democrats, sort of Irish, Italian, working class Democrats, which, used to be a thing, right?
Yeah.
But I suppose you knew someone has a very different opinion. And if a comment happened at the table that veered toward it, you could see everybody kind of go, before we get so-and-so worked up, and so-and-so maybe even fires back, whoa, blah, blah, blah. And then you kind of go, yeah, you know what? Let's talk about the Red Sox, or you change the subject. But the interesting thing to me about that was there was also a sense of tolerance that said, we know you don't agree with us, but we also really like you. You're a good guy, You brought great food to the dinner party, and you're really fun, and you're a great guy in a lot of ways. So we don't agree about that. So let's not talk about that. And this is a very, I think everybody feels this way, but we've become, sort of unable to do that. And and then I think we've also lost the ability to have those conversations, to go a little deeper and have a space where, well, for example, my mother-in-law was very, very hardcore. She's from Ohio and is a doctor. And an immigrant from Eastern Europe, fled communism in 1968, left Czechoslovakia. Okay, so there you have your setup, right? Hates liberals, hates anything that smacks of socialism, communism, because it wrecks her life.
It reminds me of the Politburo, so to speak. Yeah,
right? So, okay, and all of her friends were the same. They were all Czech and Slovak emigres. And you get together, fantastic people, the most fun people you'd ever have. They drink, they eat, they talk, they laugh, they sing songs. Hilarious. It was like the family I kind of always wanted when I met my wife. Because my family was all Irish and repressed, like, bury everything. These guys, there's no burying it. It's just out, and also all pretty much Republicans. And so, of course, the tipping point was Trump, right? And for some reason, in that case, it became harder for people to be civil with each other, I think. Before that, I remember being there for Thanksgiving once. And I was always like, they loved me. I would get along with everybody. But after a few drinks, they would start turning on me, going like, because I worked at Newsweek. Well, you're the liberal media. Why do the guys? And they start yelling about CNN doesn't.
Newsweek's the liberal media. Okay.
But like,
it was,
there was all the media was one thing to them, right? And they would start yelling about CNN did this. And I'm like, dude, I don't work at CNN. But then I would also tell them this, I think they were kind of bummed. They were expecting me to say, no, we're all I said, look, most people who work in media are liberal. They're like me. I can tell you that. I worked at Forbes magazine, which was ground zero for the pre-Tea Party, flat tax. And I told them, almost everybody who works there is liberal. We're not true believers, right? And I wasn't writing about technology. I wasn't writing about politics. I wrote about tech. The guy I worked for was a Republican candidate for president. And by the way, I met him a couple of times at these, big dinners. And he's a nice guy. He's a really good guy. He's kind of a goofball. But so my wife was unable to have a conversation with her mother about Trump. They would just immediately become super angry. And somehow I was maybe because she wasn't my mother, right? She doesn't push my buttons. But I remember saying to her once, hey, without you getting angry, without me getting angry, I think we were doing dishes, like, I really want to, like, what is it? What, I know all you guys are great, but what was it that appealed to him? Is it like some policy? Is it like you have 401ks and you want to protect your retirement? Is that, what is it? And she was like, I forget the conversation, but it basically came down to, no, it's a feeling. He loves America. And you don't know what it's like out in Ohio, Cleveland, they're in Cleveland and Akron. These cities have all fallen apart and, our house values have plummeted. And I said, oh, okay. So do you think like somehow there'll be a policy that'll make, bring that back? No, but I just like, so I realized, okay, it's just like lizard brain, right? It's just, or reptile brain. But it's like a feeling. Oh, okay. I get that. And I probably, a lot of decisions I make are based on the same thing, but we were able to have that conversation, but then we also like, let's put that back in the box, and let's talk about the kids. Cause she loves my kids, her grandkids, all that stuff. So I've gone off on this long tangent now, but
well, no, but think about that. Like you were using some of and this might have been before you wrote the book, but you were using some of the skills you talk about in the book in that conversation, right? Active listening, not talking over, not trying to make your point, right?
Yeah, that was a hard thing for me to learn. I'm still not great at it, but this concept of active listening, and I, interviewed a lot of people and did research and then tried to practice this myself. I got exercises. I think in a lot of the book, really what I've done, if it's that might be useful to people, is I don't really often have big insights of my own, but I'll go gather up, here's what everybody else is saying and put it in order. And so if you want to learn something, I'm just giving you a catalog of research that's out there. But listening, I found to be like magical, especially with my daughter. She and I have often had a strained relationship. And like a lot of parents, I had this tendency to want to solve her problems. And, there's a story in the book about her being upset about a paper and she's freaking out. She has to write a paper about this poetry and she hates the poetry, doesn't understand it. There's nothing to say. She's going to get an F and then she won't get into college. And really angry though. Like her way of freaking out is like to be really angry. Her twin brother's thing is just eats it, and he's upset about something. You got to pull it out of him.
No, the sounds like you can see the like my family, the Irish influence. They suck it up or blow up at some point, and right, like or you just make a lot of noise. Which doesn't really work in my family. It sounds like maybe the Czech side of the family you're talking about is there. I don't know. I'm making stuff up here, but
no, you're right. Yeah, my family is so funny. Like there'll be something, and we just bury it. No, I'm not angry. What? No. Why do you think I was angry? I thought you were angry. No, I'm not angry. Oh, well, okay. And then, but eventually, it's like boom, right? It's
hey, why are you freaking out?
Yeah.
Because of all this. I said, why didn't you say anything? Why you didn't figure it out yourself? Yeah. That's not a good way. Yeah, I don't do it with my patients in therapy, so that don't. Right. I'm very well behaved. I listen most of the time. Yeah.
Well, I actually asked my therapist this at one point because I thought, okay, you guys must be good listeners, and how do you do it? How did you learn to do that? Do they teach you that when you get your, she's a psychiatrist. How do you, do you develop it? And I think like a lot of people like me who actually go to therapy, if you think about it for a second, you realize like, oh my God, how does that person do that job? Like, how do you sit here every week and just even listen to me? Like you get to them because I'm sick of hearing my own stuff. And how do you sit here and do it? And then there's 5 more that day or whatever. Like it's unfathomable to me.
And what did your therapist tell you?
That you get better at it over time. You try, you try to really listen and not judge and just, and along the lines of something we were talking about before is I think she's looking for how you say it, or if you've said it over and over, like, what does that mean? She's studying the stuff, I think. And me, but I don't really know. The short answer was you just get better at it over time. And
you do. I mean, and so that means people who apply what you're doing. What in the book is, like some of the things you're talking about there are the same skills that a therapist, like the basic skills of therapy, which tend to be the things you fall back on outside of like techniques or whatever perspective your theoretical orientation is in psychotherapy. You always have to fall back on that. Even the more technique folks, good CBT therapists will look like Carl Rogers, listening for a long period of time before they break out their paperwork for you to do or homework stuff, right?
What do they do?
CBT.
Yeah, I know CBT, but I mean, I didn't know how it works. You get it
looks very techniquey, you could say. A lot of skill sets like challenging thoughts, reframing things. They might not be doing that initially. They have to they got to figure out the lay of the land, the topographical map of the person they're sitting with, right? Just like they're active listening to do that. But you're actually very busy as a therapist because you're kind of thinking about your job and how to do the best thing and the next move and trying to assess where the patient's at and move them forward with what they're working on. So it's a very active job. It looks like you're sitting all day, but you are listening, but you're also kind of juggling possibilities and ways to help someone.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've sort of observed how my therapist, I've been seeing her for 5 years, right? And how she'll nudge me to something, and I don't realize it. And when she finally kind of does give me the little, I realize, the last year was building up to this moment. She probably saw this a year ago and said, okay, I'm going to try to, get him here. And so it's a very slow process. I think you probably run into those people who've gone like 3 times and they go like, I'm still messed up. I've talked to you 3 times. So I've been coming here for 5 weeks.
Everyone comes to me and they're better after the first.
They're fixed right away. Everybody wants to get fixed fast. I think wasn't that the appeal of CBT? It's like you can get in and in just 5 weeks of intense CBT, you'll be fine.
That doesn't quite work that way. But
no,
I bet it does have more tangible. It's more, I guess, readily amenable to operationalizing definitions, right? And be more explicit maybe with some of the interventions, and you can incorporate it with other kind of like psychodynamic or humanistic or whatnot, but it's more readily availed to outcome studies, I think, because of scales and numbering and taking, graphing things and whatnot and charting things. So that's why it got a lot of hoopla. And most outcome studies are only going to be 16 weeks. They're limited. So they just want to show the numbers going up or down in certain directions, right? For symptoms. And, it's just because they have more studies. It's not because they're better than the other therapies. In fact, this is kind of off the beaten track here, but factor analysis of studies, right? Like meta-analysis of outcome,
a bunch of studies.
Of all psychotherapies, point that the main factor is what you, as the client or the patient, bring to the therapy. You're the biggest factor in the outcome of whether you're committed to it and you have some strengths and resources, and then the relationship is the second part. It's very important, and whether or not the therapist can help you bring out your strengths and move you along with that rapport. Very little of it has to do with allegiance to a technique or a therapeutic school. So I think the biggest factor is whether you're showing up and want to do the work and you feel a good rapport with the person and they're finding a way to connect with you and help you to learn that to feel good about yourself, self-efficacy, so. Yeah,
boy, that's.
Which means we'll get back to your book here. I'm going to tie this in. Watch this. Active listening is good for your relationships in and outside of therapy, right? Like therapists can do that, but you don't have to be a therapist to be able to do that. It's a very, I would say that most people who go into therapy probably do that well before they become therapists because they're so good at listening to people. And how many
they're drawn to that? They're drawn to that field. Yeah, was that the case for you? Did you you said you were a musician and an actor, and then at some point, did you just say, I'm going to go back and get a PhD and I'm going to go do this?
The funny thing is I initially wanted to do psychology, but then I was like, well, I want to do art, man. I want to create things. So I was very selfish in that way. And then after a while, I gave in. I did study hypnosis in New York to kind of use it for building characters and acting. Michael Chekhov is someone who did a lot of visualization, meditation exercises, and I saw some similarities. And then I got hooked into that, and I had a small practice in New York, and I said, I need to do this as an actual professional. So that's what hooked me back in. There's a long, circuitous route, like the plot line. If you've ever read Tristram Shandy, at the end, they like the scribbled plot line because it's so convoluted and crazy, making fun of novels. Anyway, that's my life. My life is I'm Tristram Shandy incarnate, 20th and 21st century. But
do you ever have that idea? You wonder how you even had this career. People sometimes ask me, "How did you do this?" I'm like, it was completely accidental at every step. I don't think I had any plan. Well,
but you fell into it and it made sense. You showed up, right?
Sort of,
99% of life is just showing up.
Exactly, and being on time, right? Isn't that the other way? Like, yeah, I've told my kids. I think a lot of like being a journalist. The one thing I was good at is like I would make my deadline. I'd make the word count. If the assignment was 700 words by Friday, I would have you 750, so you could cut a little by Thursday night. And they appreciate it because if you come in, I need till Monday, and it's 1,300 or 4,000 words, So I've told my kids, like, I don't have any really great genius. I'm just like good at getting stuff done on time. And I thought it was funny. I went to the University of Michigan, got an MFA in creative writing.
Oh, wow.
And for a while, I thought I was going to be a fiction writer and a professor. I wanted to be an academic. I had been a journalist for a little while. I said, no, I want to go live on some nice college campus and, teach creative writing and write my books.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Like nobody wanted to, that it took a while to realize that wasn't going to happen. But I noticed that the MFAs and the people in the clinical psych program all hung out together. Like we all got along really well, and they would all read our stuff and completely decode us. And they were like kids with a new toy. Like they had learned all this like psychology thing. Well, if you touch your, blah, 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 that's what that means. And I'm like, so they would read our stories. I actually dated a woman in the clinical psych program for a while, but everything I wrote, she would say, oh, wow, this really, I guess you really feel about that. And I was like, no, this is a made up story. This has nothing to do with me. I'm like, oh, well, it does. And I think she's probably right. Like you're writing fiction, you're really just projecting yourself right out there. But
to a certain degree, I think, I mean, I would hope that like, some people aren't like, Stephen King. I hope he's not really projecting. I hope he has a quiet home life and enjoy a cup of coffee and a newspaper in the morning.
Right. Yeah. You think about that. Like, where's that coming from? Ooh. But, I think he might have also had a really messed up childhood or life. There's something, I don't know, something gave rise to that imagination, I guess. But I mean, that's another larger question, but like, are we always revealing ourselves in our work? Right? Yeah. And
maybe we can kind of swing back to the book. Like,
get back to this is much more interesting to me. This is like, much more interesting, but this is turning into therapy. I should pay you for this hour.
Well, we'll try not to. Hold on, I have to adjust my mic here.
Sorry.
All right, so maybe get back to the book here, so we can kind of elucidate. Like,
do you get to edit this? By the way,
I try to do as little editing as possible.
Oh, you just let it go, huh? Okay.
I kind of let it go. Are you okay with that?
Oh, yeah, I'm fine.
Okay, yeah. I don't think we've said anything untoward or anything like that. So maybe you can tell us about the structure of the book, Dan. And so we can kind of like, we talked about like, I think the beginning of the book, you talk about the Talkaholic quiz. That's actually in the book in case you want to find out if you are a Talkaholic.
Right.
You can also elucidate the idea of the prefrontal cortex and the different hemispheres, kind of in those studies from that professor at University of Miami, but you talk about like various types of talkers, like nervous talker, ruminator. Maybe you can kind of go into that, and maybe people kind of like pigeonhole themselves in some of those a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, here we are. So ego talkers are the first ones, and they're sort of the obvious ones. I don't think that's, maybe keyed to narcissism, but they're the ones who just really genuinely think they're just smarter than everybody else, and their opinion is worth more. And so you should all listen to me. And I spent a lot of time writing about Silicon Valley, and that's full of those kind of guys, and they're almost always guys. Mm-hmm. And they made a lot of money on one thing, and now they're experts on everything. And you know what I mean? Like, dude, you got lucky. You got lucky with Bitcoin. Don't tell me about heart surgery, but they will.
Yeah, it reminds me. Like, I had a buddy in college who would have this comeback. Rob, he was like, you'd say something antithetical to what he would say, and he'd look at me and say, "I don't see you making $1 million." It's kind of like,
yeah.
I'm so smart because I've made a lot of money off of a product that no one's going to use in 10 years or something.
Yeah. But then I think there are nervous talkers who are just, and I'm partly that. Like, you're nervous in a certain situation and it makes you babble, right? And I have blurters who are people. I had a friend who was a blurter, who typically very, very smart, really fast. Like, comedy writers are often blurters, but in a comedy writing room, that's great. But in a party with people you don't really know or who are a little uptight, being a blurter can be a bad thing. And then blabbers, people who blab. Those are people that just, like they tell the same stories over and over. My mother-in-law is a blabber. I've heard those stories a million times. We've got a neighbor who's a blabber. They just come over. I think often they're lonely. Mm-hmm. They don't have anybody to talk to. But also you realize they know that they've told you this story many times. And yet they keep telling it. So there's got to be something in it for them. I don't know what it is. And I do that too. My kids, I have things that in the book I call them monologues instead of monologues, because men tend to do this. But in my family, we call them danologues. And I guess there are so many of them. They're sort of stock. One time, I don't know, the last 6 months, we were having dinner, and I started like first sentence of a thing I must have said many times. And before I could say the second sentence, my son just started saying all the rest of it in like, Mike, don't like dad, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, I had to laugh. I was like, God, you're so right. Like, that's like, you got me down, Okay. So, then there are ruminators. I kind of like ruminators. They're like people who just want to think out loud. Like, it helps them to walk around and talk about it or sit at their desk, but they need to hear it out loud, not in their head. And then there are talkaholics. And I think I'm definitely one of those. And those researchers who defined it as, you're not just someone who talks too much. You're not gregarious. You're not an extrovert. You cannot not speak. Like, it's a compulsion. It's almost an addiction. And the key thing was, that this thing you're about to say is going to hurt you, and yet you say it. Or, saying nothing would be very much in your benefit, and yet you say it. And they figured about 5% of the population are what they would call talkaholics. And there is a test that they developed. Now, I don't know how, hardcore scientific the test is, but it's probably ballpark right. And it's 16 questions. You do it really quickly. You self-score it. It's kind of fun, actually. I've had a lot of people try it, and Time Magazine actually ran it as a sidebar. So you could go to Time Magazine and get the link from the story, and then go in and take this quiz, and then you can score other people. So you can score yourself, and then I might just have my wife score me to verify how
self-score, other score, yeah.
So those are the kind of talkers. I think there are 6 that I sort of identified as separate things, and there's definitely overlap, but
okay. And I mean, you were talking about dance-splaining. What about like mansplaining and this whole, you have a chapter that goes into how, what I found pretty interesting, the studies on, observational studies and how men over talk more, right? And,
right.
Gender, sex, and women tend to interrupt less. And then you had a very interesting, examples of people who transitioned from female to male or male to female, and their observations of what happened to them in their professional setting.
Yeah, that I thought was mind blowing. But before I get to that, yeah, I wanted to say, you mentioned the structure of the book. The one thing I had problem with, I had an idea for the proposal, but I really didn't know how to make it a book. And I had an editor who was very smart. He said, like, okay, let's do this. Introduction, tell your story, set it up. Chapter 1 that sort of lays out, the landscape. Couple chapters on the internet and social media. And then let's just go into things. So then the next chapter is mansplaining, manterrupting, and monologue. So that's gender, right? And then STFU is medicine, which is like mind-blowing, fascinating. And there's a psychologist who's done crazy work. You should have him as a guest. Then STFU at work, at home, in love. STFU is power, and STFU and listen. So it sort of works. So he had this idea, let's break it into different aspects of your life, ways in which talking less in this aspect of your life will help you. And with the big ending is listening, because I think that's the real reason to shut up, is because you give yourself space to listen. But on the gender thing, I think it's amazing, because basically, as far back as you can go back 2,000 years to St. Paul and have him in his letters saying that women and widows are talkative and you should stay away from them and they're idle tongues or whatever. In the Middle Ages, there were things called sins of the tongue, and you could be, tried criminally and punished for what you said. And they were almost always applied to women more than to men. And they did, horrific things. If you were accused of or convicted of a sin of the tongue, like gossip was a big one, they would, there was a thing called the scold's bridle, which is like a metal cage they would put over your head with a bit that would go under your tongue so you couldn't really talk. And they'd either make you stand in the village square wearing this thing, or they would walk you around the village. It was really like horrific. Basically to punish you for what you said. And oddly enough, you read that and go like, oh my God, that's so medieval, right? And there is a photo, if you go to Google and look up Scold's Bridle, in the early 1900s in Northern Ireland, a prisoner is wearing one of those. It's like,
wow.
Yeah, man. It's like, so basically it's used against women. Even now you'll hear, I think during the Olympics, when the guy who was the head of the Olympic Committee, who had been the prime minister of Japan, ended up having to step down because he said something about, well, you think we should have more women on the committee, but then the meetings would never end because the women would just keep talking, But so there's this whole stereotype. And I forget when year this book came out, I think it's 2006, The Female Brain came out. I remember that book. Mm-hmm. And her big claim, the thing that really got her a lot of media attention, was that women speak 20,000 words a day and men speak 6 or 7. There's like a 3x difference, women versus men. And everybody latched onto that because it was like, here's the old stereotype. And guess what? Science shows it's true. Only, people who study speech very quickly said, no, that's just way off. We've never seen anything like that. So a grad student at UT Austin, who I later write the chapter about medicine on, did his own study and found out, no, they're both about the same 16,000 words a day, men and women. And in fact, in our study, the 3 most extreme overtalkers were men. And the amazing thing is that the response to that was so aggressive. He told me that he saved the voicemails because they were so hostile. Men, writing and calling and saying you're an idiot, blah, blah, blah. Like, men get really angry about this. You'd think, even if you didn't agree with the study, I'm not going to write to the guy. You got an email. And I mentioned something along the lines about this on LinkedIn. Same deal. It's an amazing issue that really triggers people.
So men were getting upset that they were being accused of over talking or something like that?
Yeah. Oh, because you were like, this is the same old sexist. It's reverse sexism, blah, 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 blah. It's like, no, it's observational. And then there are a lot of studies that show in the workplace, at academic conferences. Someone did a study on Supreme Court justices and interruptions. Women Supreme Court justices got interrupted way more than men, way more than men.
Okay, yeah,
and most often by men.
Mm-hmm.
So there's study after study that show men, just doing more of the talking. You know, if you do a study where women and men speak 50% of the time each, the men perceive it as the women did all the talking. You know, so there's just gobbling up the air. There's the interruption. The interruption thing to me is so amazing. I feel like if you're a man and you're in a meeting, you have to instantly, proactively think, I may have a tendency to interrupt, because it's, I think, the way we're socialized. I don't think it's, necessarily that these are bad people, but oddly enough, if you tape a meeting or record a Zoom call, you can see it and hear it. And often men see that and go, oh my God, I had no idea I was doing that. So then I tried to come up with strategies, or actually to gather up strategies for how to stop interrupting and how to stop someone else who is interrupting. And then there's, mansplaining, which we all know about, the idea of the guy who likes to explain something to you that you already, the woman who is a psychologist who really knows her field, but there's some guy at a party who doesn't know anything about psychology, but he's going to tell her all about this new study. And she's like, yeah, no, the famous ones where I've seen this on Twitter where someone says, I just had a guy mansplain to me the book that I wrote. Like, wow, you ought to read this book. Apparently you haven't read this, and blah, blah, blah. And he's like, dude, I wrote that book. Like, did you not look at the name? My wife is a PhD and very, very smart. And she speaks a bunch of languages. Her PhD was in Russian, Slavic language and literature. So as part of that, she's just learned a lot of languages. And so German, she's pretty good in German. We were at a party once and there was like a investment banker kind of guy or a finance guy. Boston has a lot of these finance bros. And I think it was kind of like he said, what's that word? There's that German word that means like, you're taking pleasure in someone else's pain or something. And she was like, yeah, it's Schadenfreude. No, I don't think it's that. It's like, is it Bildungsroman or something? I'm making this up now. Some other word of Weltschönkraft. And she's like, no, it's Schadenfreude. He's like, is it? I don't think so. And finally she said, look, I speak German. It's Schadenfreude. I speak German. And he goes, yeah, but I don't think it's Schadenfreude. I think it's something else. It's like, you cannot unmansplain that guy. And
well,
my wife has said,
you did use the term finance bro. So, and cultural kind of a thing, maybe like, it might be, but it's also a cultural script, I think, for all of society, for people to dismiss that. Hey, listening, people don't really listen. And you mentioned you've been finding it kind of a magical experience to be more of an active listener rather than active talker and thinker. Like, so do you feel like your life having kind of applied some of the active listening techniques, and maybe you can kind of explain those and which one worked best for you, or what seems to be like what the techniques you use for like reducing talking or stopping telling yourself to shut the F up. Which ones actually, what are they, and which ones work best, do you think, for you thus far?
Well, I will tell you that we talked at the beginning about the fact that my marriage, my wife and I had separated, and I'm convinced that we're back together, and I'm convinced that my learning to listen and also to really, really, really talk less, to actually sit together in silence, had a big part in helping us do that. And the same with my daughter, who I had a strained relationship with, and just simply listening to her, I think made a tremendous difference. And I came up with a few little games that I play with myself. So one is called When Possible, Say Nothing. And that doesn't, of course it's always possible. But in other words, when you're at the checkout counter, you don't need to ask the clerk, so how you doing? What time do you get off? How long you work here? Like, you don't need to say any of that. You don't need to strike up a conversation. In other words, there's a funny game called Pretend Words Are Money, where it came from this guy, Lou Wasserman, who is a big Hollywood exec, sort of like the king of Hollywood, who never told anyone anything. He just gathered information and he gave none away. And his biographer said it was he and his mentor treated words as if they were money, that a conversation's a transaction. You want to get more than you give. And so that's a game I play sometimes. I put signs up over my desk. Unfortunately, I'm not paying attention to them now, to say things like quiet, listen, wrap it up. I think I also try before, say, a professional meeting, to take some deep breaths to really remind myself, okay, let everybody else talk. So yeah, I think you have to be intentional about it. I think that's the difficulty with listening, is that it's not just hearing. Mm-hmm. It's, you have to be really actively listening and trying to retain information, and it's intentional, I think is the best way to put it.
So setting an intention for yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't recall, maybe because I skipped over it because I was kind of reading for research reasons and purposes for this interview. But did you go into, did any of the experts you talk about discuss maybe attachment theory and the need to speak? If that was anything.
No. And you know what? Once again, I've had this happen 3 times this week where someone mentioned something and I go, I wish I knew that.
Wait. Like the vast amount of literature and studies out there, like that's, that makes sense. I'm not bringing it up to
what is it?
Well, attachment theory is like how you connect to people in relationships. And typically there's securely attached folks who feel secure in themselves. They don't feel like they need to cling tenaciously to someone. They're not afraid of being abandoned. They don't feel smothered by the presence of other people and withdraw. Typically, the 2 types of attachments you might find out there that are not secure, or people might have a proclivity in certain situations to feel more anxious about their intimate relationships or friendships. Especially in an intimate relationship, they might feel that they might lose someone, or not lose their space within the relationship, or feel abandoned, possibility of abandonment. Those people tend to be more anxiously attached, and they try to put the other person above themselves. And more avoidant tend to be those who don't like close proximity with another person, right? And this has been backed up by lots of studies, by starting with Mary Ainsworth and John Bowlby and whatnot. This concept of attachment in psychotherapy, and it's been universal, basically observed through scientific methods across cultures. So it's usually the first attachment relationship is with the mother, and then the first 7 years are basically the development of a person's core relationship maps, and any kind of conflicts they might need to work out later on in their relationships kind of come up 7 years, right, with the family. So you're kind of imprinting for humans. So I'm wondering, if there's part of, when I see people in sessions, sometimes if people, kind of have that they're talkaholic kind of proclivity, I'm wondering if, yes, they might have ADHD or they might have hypomania, but maybe they actually really just feel a need to make themselves known without connecting on an I thou kind of relational experience or conversational experience. However, albeit the sessions are about them, but some people really feel a need to talk a lot. It's almost like they're dumping in the session, right? Catharting, if you will. And I tend to see most of those people as if not through any means of testing, I kind of think, well, maybe they're a little bit more anxiously attached and they want to feel like, they're being heard and connected with more so than people who are quieter. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, that made me think about, I don't think I get into this in the book, but I think part of my own over talking, which really was a problem. Like I would go to a party, walk in saying to myself, don't talk too much, don't talk too much, don't talk too much. Like I would really prepare and then still sometimes talk too much, usually because I got to laugh. And then when that started, because I was sort of dabbled as a comedy writer for a while, I'd get a laugh and then I'd be like, I got to get another laugh and another laugh. And then I'd start going and then I'm monologuing and people would be laughing, but after a point, they're like, dude, let someone else talk. Right. You're not here to give a show. And I think I even thought back then, I kind of felt like I have to earn my spot here. Like I need to be entertaining to prove that like I'm worthy or something. There's something of value to add, right? Yeah. I recently talked to a guy who does. He's a huge monologue, way over talks. This is in a professional setting. And he said, well, I always feel that, if I'm the boss and I call a meeting with a bunch of people, I need to, talk for 30 minutes and give them all. I'm supposed to have great ideas. And if I'm with people above me in the organization, I can't just sit there. I need to be like showing them that I'm smart and here's what I bring. And I thought, you're trying to earn your job. Right. And that's probably hard. You're trying to show them, no, look, I'm really smart. Look, I have great ideas, but I wonder if that was it. For me, I'm sure to some extent it was like saying like, I'm at a party with a bunch of neighbors, but it's not, they don't just like me. I have to sort of, prove to them like, I have good ideas or whatever. I'm bringing something to this other than a bottle of wine and some flowers, right?
Right. Well, I mean, when you show up at those kind of parties, there is this kind of like, what do you do for a living? Oh, I do this. I make this much money. I don't see you making $1 million. That kind of, right? And there is that kind of, and I think that male roles are kind of, there's a proclivity for us to kind of like, show off, right? Or how big our members are, or whatever. There's that kind of like you have to assert yourself, and sometimes that can be like proving yourself. And women can do that too sometimes, but like I think it is a wanting to be accepted, right? And that's the way some people like approach relationships, to feel accepted, to make sure that the person likes them.
Like you're really working hard to win them over.
Yeah.
And which is funny because in the book, the same guy, Michael Beatty, who did the neuropsychology work about talkaholics, teaches a class at University of Miami called like Communication and Love or something, basically relationships, and always oversubscribed because he's a very colorful, great lecturer, but it's all about, going on dates, and they're college kids. So they all want to know, like, how can I, get better?
How can I game the system? Yeah.
Or just like, how can I become better at getting a girlfriend or a boyfriend? Like, what should I do? And he shows them clips of movies, and this is why this works. James Bond is one of his favorites, but he has this 60-40 rule. It says that on a like first date or any date, but let's say it's a first date, you should both be talking in that range of 60-40. It can be 50-50, 61-40 the other. But if you swing out beyond that, the date's a disaster, because it means one person's doing all the talking and the other feels just like they can't get a word in edgewise, or vice versa. And I thought that was an interesting thing, to find that balance. And then completely separately, other studies have found that works for salespeople. Making a sales call, that balance. And it's almost exactly, I think it's 56-44 or something, but they used AI to study 500,000 hours of sales calls. What works? It's the same balance.
Sense. Yeah. Well, I mean, you are selling yourself on a first date. Some people like that. Some people don't care. Some people love it. And if you're selling something, you have to be able to figure out what the person wants if you're selling them fuller brushes, how could they use it? How can you make them feel that they need this thing that they might not need?
Yeah. because I think, and I do a lot of work.
You have to listen.
Yeah, but I do a lot of work that's corporate, And I was just, when you said fuller brush, I just thought, because the typical thing you'd think was, I get on the phone, I'm selling this brush, and I'm going to tell you, Scott, like, this brush is so good. There's other brushes, they can do this, but this brush has more bristles, and this brush is made of that, and it's got this great handle. And it's like they're selling the product, not listening to you, going like, well, what do you do? What's your day like? What problems do you have? And then going, this brush, could fix, the whole idea, like listening to what the person wants.
Yeah.
And I think that was the idea with sales, is that it's more successful salespeople solve your problem, right?
I think the best example of how a good sale or a good or bad salesman works is this old Looney Tunes cartoon with Daffy Duck trying to sell to Elmer Fudd. Of course, who's a millionaire and he owns a mansion and a yacht, and he goes to his mansion and he's like bringing these gizmos in that destroy it over time, like vacuum cleaners that go out of control and remote control rip the walls up and the foundation. And Elmer Fudd fixes him by blowing the house up with him in it, right? And of course, the last scene is Elmer Fudd is on this stationary, the door frame is where he's at, and a little bit of the house, and it's flying upwards against the force of the explosion, and he's standing there with no door. And of course, the booby trap was the door handle for when Daffy shows up to knock on the door again and open the door. And he's flying past Elmer and says, "Hey, buddy, I know what you need. You need a house to go with this doorknob." Kind of like the ultimate sales example of sales. Yeah.
That's like relentless, the relentless sales guy.
Yeah, constantly. And I figured out your need. Yeah.
That's a good story.
Yeah. So, well, interesting. Maybe we should kind of wrap up here. Is there any conclusion you would like to state? Any genius to declare?
Oh my God. You just made that Oscar Wilde joke.
I know, in verse.
I told my daughter that the other night. She just came back from a 6-week thing in France and had gone through customs. And I said, well, you know what Oscar Wilde said when he was asked if you have anything to declare. He said, I have nothing to declare about my genius. But,
I know.
You know that.
Corny.
It's such a, but exactly. How is he seen as such a wit? It was really kind of but there was one big thing this psychologist at University of Arizona named Matthias Mail came up with. This is the one thing, I don't know why it sticks with me more than anything out of the book, is that they found that people who spend less time on small talk and more time having like good conversations, which they mean substantive, where there's a good balance, a 60-40 balance, and you're talking about interesting things. So like this conversation, those people are happier than other people when they correlate the scores. Then he did another one and found out they're actually healthier. They have a better immune system. And that really, I don't know why, to me, that was the most revelatory thing, that you can actually make yourself happier, make yourself healthier by focusing on the way you talk and the kind of conversations you have.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
That's cool. So a big secondary gain. If we all learn to shut the fuck up, we can actually be healthier and happier.
And make everybody around us happier.
Yeah. Well, how many people actually listen? I mean, most people feel like no one understands them, right? I mean, that's a huge thing.
Oh, God, we could do a whole thing about listening and the experts, but it's really hard. That's the problem. It's literally really hard to be a good listener.
It is a skill that my parents did not teach me. My teachers did not teach me. Well, some of the teachers in grad school taught me that, but that's because I was being paid to listen after I got out, or an internship and stuff. So, but yeah, I think it's a very important skill. The book is, once again.
Oh, yes, STFU. You want me to say that? It's STFU. Yes. The book is STFU, The Power of Keeping Your Mouth Shut in an Endlessly Noisy World. Okay. And it's from which publisher? Henry Holt. And it's coming out very soon, this month, correct? Yeah, March 7th, actually, in a few days. Yeah. In a few days. Excellent. Well, I highly recommend it.
It is a fascinating read. It's a very personable read, very readable because of that, well written, and you will learn a lot from it, and you will probably take a lot from it as you read it. Well, Dan, thank you so much for being on the Psychology Talk podcast. I appreciate your time. If you'd like to come back any other point in time, you're more than welcome.
Oh, I'd love that. I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you.
I did too. So, all right. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you for listening. Did you know the Psychology Talk podcast is all over the World Wide Web? Well, not entirely all over, but we are on social media and we do have a website. Pop over to www.psych-talk.com to find out more about the show. All material is copyright the Psychology Talk podcast. Opinions of our guests are not necessarily those of the host or the show. Material is provided for entertainment and informative purposes only. If you need a mental health professional, please seek one out. Music is provided by the band Serenati.